is at Bethel. I noticed they were encouraging all the staff and students to come on Saturday to this interfaith seminar that was going to be at St. Thomas with a bunch of the other schools. And and that's all fine, but you have to hold firm, and you can't compromise. And that's what happened with the Israelites. They compromised. They said, well, that's okay. We'll make adjustments with these people, or we won't kick everybody out. Things, or worshiping Baal and God, maybe that's okay. But the fifth paragraph I thought really hit. We believe that all religions are basically the same, at least the ones we read was. They all believe in love and goodness. They only differ on matters of creation, sin, heaven, hell, God, and salvation.
Nothing important. Yeah, nothing important.
Nothing important, right? And then the part about Jesus was a good man, just like Buddha, Muhammad, and ourselves. He was a good moral teacher, though we think his good morals were bad. So it's something to keep in mind for when people do go to interfaith things. It's not that you need to have a skill set to be able to communicate with people and team up with different groups, even though you don't agree with them 100%. Like teaming with the Mormons on the abortion issue. Well, they're on the same page for the most part with evangelicals. So, I mean, that's a good thing to do. But you can't. Doesn't mean, well, we accept their theology of God or man becoming a god. So, anyways, last week we a quick review. We ended up in Numbers in chapter 40, where the Shekinah glory came down, and which is a real interesting thing, that this Shekinah glory, which you see throughout the Old Testament, and how even Abraham saw the Shekinah glory. God made a covenant with him, a unilateral covenant that didn't depend on Abraham. And then when they had the sacrifices, they would split them in half, and then the two men in that culture would walk through those sacrifices together. They were bound by that covenant, and you did not back out. But Moses was put into a deep sleep, and then the Shekinah glory came down and went through the sacrifices, meaning that it wasn't dependent on Abraham or his seed to fulfill the covenant. It was God's part that was going to, and we see that over and over again now as we watch the children of Israel. Were they faithful? No. Were they better than anybody else? No. But God had chosen them, and he was going to fulfill his covenant. And it was interesting, Moses would remind God of that. He says, remember you made that covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God says, I know. And then we decided we were going to skip Leviticus. I gave you a little handout that showed all the sacrifices that are described in Leviticus and how they all point to Christ. And that's one of the things that we're talking about too, how all the Old Testament, every book points to Jesus Christ. And Paul always referred back to the Old Testament. That was his baseline. And all of, even the just shall live by faith. Well, where did Paul get that? He got it from the Old Testament. And so embedded in the Old Testament are the New Testament truths. And of course, all of the prophecies of Jesus are always there. Sometimes the prophecies they didn't understand them until they were fulfilled. And even the disciples, they didn't get it until, Jesus rose from the dead. Oh yeah, and I'm thinking of, the road to Emmaus after Jesus rose from the dead. So these two guys are walking down the road, and this guy joins them, and they don't recognize him. And he starts expounding all the law and the prophets to them. Well, if it was important to Jesus, it should be important to us. And then, somebody has said once, I'd sure like to have the sermon notes for that talk that Jesus gave, expounding all the law and the prophets and how it pointed to him. And then all of a sudden, oh, it was Jesus. So the book of Numbers now, which we've started, is really a continuation of Exodus. There's some repeats, which we're going to get to. We listened to Tim Keller, and he talked about the gospel in Numbers, which is a short little 10-minute clip. Sometimes when I watch these little 10-minute clips by Keller talking about this book, I'm saying, oh, okay, we got it. And when I gave you an outline of the book, and really, the children of Israel going on this path through the wilderness, it's kind of like the Pilgrim's Progress book, where they're meeting all these difficulties and and they're on their way to the promised land, and little Pilgrim was on his way to the celestial city. And then we talked about Romans 15 and 1 Corinthians 10 again, how all of these things it says in the Old Testament, all of these examples are written down for our benefit. That's, we can apply these things to our lives. And they took a new census of the people, and it was of the fighting men, and the numbers hadn't changed really much. Even after the 40 years in the wilderness and the people died off, after the new census, it was just about the same. Not counting the women and children, so it made the number probably 2 million people. And so if you're going to feed 2 million people, you got a problem if you don't have God. And then in Numbers 2, we talked about the arrangement of the camp, how it was really concrete sequential. Everything was centered around the tabernacle in the middle. They all had their marching duties, who leaves first, and who was in what group. There were the 4 groups with 3 tribes in each, and everybody had a place. And we talked about the Fiddler on the Roof, about tradition. And Teviar says, by our traditions, we know who we are and what God expects of us. And so traditions and routines are not bad. I mean, they can get ridiculous, like, why do you always do this? Because, well, my mom did it, Or in churches, why do we always do something? I remember when we were in a different church that had the tradition of, at the end of the service, it was always the invitation, come forward and pray. And I was teaching the college and career group that one day, and they were going to the denominational school. And so I just asked them, I said, so do you think, to really be heard, you have to go forward to pray? And one kid came up with an interesting insight. He says, well, maybe back in the old days, the potbelly stove with the fire was in the front of the church, and you went forward to keep warmer. And then it kind of morphed into, well, this is what we always do. So, and I remember too, the pastor had the youth pastor preach, and once again, the tradition was you always have an altar call, and you always come forward to pray. So he finished the sermon, which was probably a little lackluster, and he gave the invitation, and nobody came forward. So the pastor and his wife, they got out, they went forward, and that was the cue. Okay, everybody's supposed to move forward. So, and then we went into quickly the jobs of the Levites. Once again, everybody knew their place. If you're from this family group, this is what you do. If you're gonna carry the ark or whatever, or you're gonna put up the curtains, or you're gonna clean out the brazen altar or whatever, and carry that. And, think of with 2 million people, if you didn't have routines, I mean, even, and Karen realizes this from being in a classroom, if you had 30 kids and you don't have a routine, it can certainly go into chaos pretty quick. So, okay, so that was our last week. So we're going to get into more of Numbers right now. I had a quote that I had given you before too, and when we remember all of these men, even Moses, who was not perfect, Moses had an anger issue, Aaron was wishy-washy, he compromised. We still are kind of in awe of Aaron sometimes when his excuse to Moses, well, why did you do this? He says, well, you know these people, and I got their gold, and out came this calf. And I'm sure he was saying something like, really? Moses, really? We went to Chanhassen to hear a group that did Peter, Paul, and Mary, so they were singing their songs, which brought back a lot of memories. They were really good. But one of the songs, which is not at all a very Christian song, is Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, and it's talking about he's leaving, and I've had 100 like you, there'll be 1,000 before I'm through, And the gal that was portraying Mary, after those guys got done singing, she just looked at them and she said, really? And then she said, ick. So I'm glad they put a little bit of a context in there that wasn't the way to operate in life. Okay, Numbers chapter 5. If you want to turn there.
Numbers 5.
Numbers 5. So this is talking about defilement, death, and restitution. Once again, a lot of really important things for them to deal with. And you needed to have some benchmarks. Okay, what are we going to do? And this is how we do it. So one was the isolation of the sick. Those of you that have been in the medical field, you know that's pretty important now. And in our society today, we understand the germ theory of disease. That they did not have microscopes. They did not, Louis Pasteur had not lived yet to talk about germs. And I mentioned this book before in an earlier passage called None of These Diseases by Dr. McMillan. And he talks about that all of these medical rules, they did that kind of blindfolded. They did that because God said for them to do it. But they had no concept, once again, of why. So this is a quote, this is a review of the book. It says, as they describe scientific discoveries relative to infectious diseases, the authors point out that God had Moses record guidelines to protect people against microorganisms long before they were known to cause disease. They identify specific scriptures that address hand washing, quarantine, circumcision, proper treatment of dead bodies, proper disposal of human feces, all of which are recognized today as measures significant in the prevention and control of infectious diseases. Relative to circumcision, they call attention to God's instruction to circumcise on the 8th day, which can be confirmed medically as the ideal time for the procedure to be performed in order to prevent uncontrolled bleeding and excessive trauma. And that's with the clotting properties that are there. The authors call specific attention to God's warning about the physical, mental, sociological effects of excessive use of alcohol, problems of disease related to alcoholism, reference to be made to damage of nerves, body organs, damage to newborns, sexual disorders. Attention is also called to the number of highway deaths and broken homes resulting from alcohol abuse. Obviously, we're not going to go back to prohibition, but alcohol is one, it's a domino effect in society. And we've talked about how during the lockdown, guess which stores were made sure to be left open, the liquor stores.
They were essential.
They were exception.
Essential.
Essential
Yeah,
places,
right.
just like the grocery stores.
Yeah.
Now, the choice is if they hadn't, what would have happened? I don't.
Emergency rooms would have been full.
Yeah, right. So it's kind of like, the lottery too, where they say, well, look at all the good we do. Well, what's the other side of all the people that have to go to counseling and because of excessive gambling and the people that go financially broke, what? There's that other cost. We get some nice parks out of the deal and stuff.
Broken marriages.
And broken marriages too, because of the gambling addiction. It is an addiction for some people. And I always hate when I'm paying at a convenience store and the person in front of me, and I want 5 of those and, okay. It's kind of like in the grocery store when you're waiting, somebody's paying with a check. Come on.
Or giving out change.
Or change, let me get the change, okay. Or stand in a line when Kmart used to be open, but anyways, that's beside the point. And then God's plan for sexuality is contrasted with the practices of homosexuality, incest, adultery, which lead to devastating consequences such as STDs, neurotic behavior. They explain how these violations of God's instructions have not only affected those directly involved, but generated problems for society as a whole. So, this book was probably written, 40, 50 years ago. And it's really a classic. It's called None of These Diseases. Okay, number 6. Why doesn't somebody read number 6, 1 through 3?
The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or a woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite, he must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or from other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazirite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. During the entire period of the vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. He must be holy until the Lord of his separation to the Lord is over. He must let his hair of his head grow long. 6. Throughout the period of a separation to the Lord, he must not go near a dead body.
Okay. Well, a Nazarite vow then. Now, John the Baptist in the New Testament was a Nazarite. And when we see, depictions of him on, books or Bibles, videos, he's a pretty wild looking guy. But it set him apart too. Now, the other one that's the main Nazarite that we know about was who?
Samson.
Yeah, Samson. And if you remember, I did a sermon that compared Samson to Caleb. And I had this as one of the slides. That's what Samson probably looked like. He did probably get it braided. But that really set him apart. I don't think it was the common practice for the men back then to have long hair. So by having long hair, people knew he was a Nazarite. Now, John the Baptist, kept his vow. We don't have any record of him, going on an alcohol binge or something like that. But Samson didn't take it real seriously. Now, this is talking about people that maybe do it for a period of time. So I'm going to be a Nazarite for a year. Now, Samson, you got to, to be sympathetic to him somewhat, it was from birth. His parents were giving the instruction, okay, this is the deal. Okay, nothing, you're not going to cut his hair. You're not going to do it. He's not going to drink any alcohol or wine. And drinking wine back in those days, that was the healthier drink in some ways because it had some antibiotic quality to it. The water wasn't always that clean. But Samson, of course, he was even a trickster about it. Remember how he killed a lion, and then he went back and the lion was dead, and he took the honey out, and he brought the honey to his parents and said, hey, here's some honey for you. And he says, he didn't tell them that he got it from a dead body. So, and of course, just his womanizing was kind of negating. But and sometimes you think, well, why didn't God just nail him right from the start? Because God is patient. Eventually, Samson paid the price with his life. And the saddest, and I'm rehashing the sermon now, the saddest part ever of Samson's life is when he woke up, she had cut his hair, and he thought that he'd get up just like every other time, and he didn't realize the spirit was gone. And he was as weak as any other man, and they gouged out his eyes, symbolic of him, his spiritual blindness as well. So, little side note on Samson. So, now, for most of you probably here, except for maybe Guy, I was thinking, okay, what's kind of a modern example or mythical example of a Nazarite? Okay, if some of you have ever watched about The Mandalorian, okay, The Mandalorian, when he was a boy, he took a vow that he would not remove his helmet. Mandalorian is from the Star Wars series, and so he took a vow not to remove his helmet, and he always says, when confronted with his lifestyle, he says, "It is the way." And probably John the Baptist, when people said, "Why are you doing this?" he says, "This is the way. This is the way that's been laid out for me anyways." So, now, like I said, even in that culture, it was distinctive. Now, it was and unusual to have long hair. Now, in today's world, back in the 60s with the hippies, that was more of a norm where you had long hair. Well, not the norm, but it was more common to see that. The guy that played Paul Stookey in this concert, he had hair down to his shoulders. And it was all gray though. I was kidding Diane too. I said, looking around here, I said, there's sure a lot of gray heads. That's their clientele there at the Chanhassen, for, especially for baby boomer music legends. That's how they get their money. Okay, and then chapter 9. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 2.
The Lord spoke to Moses in the desert of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they came out of Egypt. He said, have the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay, so once again, God is instructing them, I want you to do the Passover. And here's how you know when it's going to be too. And I think most of us know that the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, not solar, so that it's based on when the full moon is, and it's based on how many days, I don't have it all written in front, but it's how many days, something like after a full moon. And that's how we get Easter too, and Easter is tight, and that's why Easter changes. It's not like, well, it's always the first Sunday in April. No, it changes. And Passover also changes depending on, so we're tied with that Passover as well. And we, as doing Easter, we should remember the Passover in the same way, like we did at Good Friday service here. So, and it's amazing really when you think of it, that tradition, I mean, you're talking 3,000-4,000 years ago, and the Jews are still celebrating Passover, and the same way, with the same dates. It's not like they've modified and say, well, we're always going to do it, March 30th. No. That wouldn't be right. Why? Because it's tradition. It's a good tradition. Because God always wanted them to remember particularly that event. Okay, and then verses 15 through 16 there, once again, God is instructing them, this is your mode of guidance throughout. There's going to be a pillar of fire and a cloud. And when that moves, you move. Which would be really nice, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be nice if God just said, well, when I want you to do this, you're going to see this. Well, God doesn't work that way. But for them, during that wilderness wandering, he did. And someone said once, and maybe you've said this before, when you realize that in a desert, it gets really cold at night, and it's really hot during the day, that having a nice big fire in the middle of the big encampment, that might be pretty nice. And during the day, it might be nice to have a nice big cloud. So God was providing for them even in that way, as well as all the food. Well, chapter 10, and you realize we are skipping things, and that is intentional. Somebody read, we'll give Tom a break here, verses 29 through 31 in chapter 10. This is an interesting interplay.
And Moses said to Hobab,
Also known as Jethro. Okay.
that's good, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we're setting out to the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us and we will do you good, for the Lord has promised good concerning Israel. But he said to him, I will not come, but rather will go to my own land and relatives. And then he said, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will be as eyes for us.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so Jethro, remember, Moses spent 40 years with Jethro in the desert of Midian. I mean, he was his former employee, and he was also his father-in-law. He married his oldest daughter. They were close, and they got along. And he's come to visit, and I'm not sure how long he'd been there. Remember, he brought back Zipporah and the 2 sons after they were out of Egypt. So he might have been with them for a while. And it's for one thing, it's a good example that Moses gives here. He's inviting others to join in the journey that aren't part of the group. And that's what we should do. We should invite others that aren't in our sphere of influence or, our ethnic group or whatever, to join with us. Now, we know that Jethro did believe in the true God. It said he was a priest of Midian. Now, he was a Midianite, and a lot of the Midianites apparently were kind of nomadic, and they were in deserts. Now, there were the Midianites that, remember, they fought with them too later on. So there was a country where Midian was, and they were really hostile to the Israelites. But we know that Jethro was not. Now Moses then tries to get him to stay to no avail. He wanted to go back to his people. Remember, he had 6 other daughters. They were probably married and they had kids. He wanted to go back and see his grandkids, which is very understandable. And even great-grandkids. I mean, he was, Moses is 80-ish or more at this point. So he's got to be, 100 anyways. He was a long liver. It's that desert living. But I can imagine that would be a big draw for him. I want to go back to my people. You all know Jonathan and Mosu. Well, Mosu's dad was here in America, and Grandma still lives with Mosu, but Grandpa, he wanted to go back to Liberia. He didn't like it here. He comes back here once in a while for some medical things, if you've grown up in a country all your life, I mean, the culture here is a lot different, I would imagine, than being in Liberia. And you think of yourself, okay, let's say we transplanted you and you went to live in Sweden or Norway or, everybody talks different here, and all my family's not here. I'd probably want to go back too, even if it's nice. I mean, or New Zealand, I always wanted to go to New Zealand, but probably wouldn't want to stay there and live there. So we can kind of understand. Now, J. Vernon McGee says Moses did make a mistake here. He wanted him to stay because he knew, as Jethro knew the land, and that he would help guide them. Well, J. Vernon says the problem with this is that God was to lead them, not Jethro. And Jethro might have said, we should go over there. Well, the cloud's going that way. But it is true that he probably knew where the watering holes were and where the oases were. So the question is, was he just being nice to him? Obviously, he liked him. So we don't know. We don't know Moses' motivation there in asking him. But the main thing is that he had to remember that God was going to guide them, not Jethro. And maybe in hindsight, Jethro maybe saw things coming down the road, because they were not going to go into the promised land right away. It was going to be another 40 years. He's probably not going to be around 40 years more. So he kind of cut his losses and said, I'm going back. And then verses 35 through 36, which is a neat verse, and we're going to hear a song about that in a minute. So verses 35 through 36.
And whenever the ark set out, Moses said, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it rested, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel."
All right. So that should ring a bell. It rang a bell for me. There's an old Maranatha praise song, "Let God arise, let your enemies be scattered."
They livened it up a little bit.
They livened it up. So that would be a good morning prayer, wouldn't it? Let God arise and let my enemies be scattered. And that was once again, that was a routine. When they broke camp, that's what they did. And that would be interesting. It probably wasn't that version. But I bet it was, if you had all 2 million people singing it.
That scared the enemy.
Okay, well, chapter 11. Well, we've had some good things. Now we're going back. We're going backwards again. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. So verses 1 through 4 in chapter 11. Somebody get that one.
Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord. And when he heard them, his anger was aroused. Then fire from the Lord burned upon them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried out to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was called Taberah, because the fire from the Lord had burnt among them.
Yeah. So, once again, you got to remember too, all of the things that had happened previously. These are still the same people that had the 10 plagues seen, delivered from Egypt, went over the Red Sea, had water from the rock. And then they say, you know, this is kind of a bad deal. Remember back in Egypt, we really had it good. Really? Making bricks. With no straw. Probably having a lifespan of 30, 40 years at the max. Unless you were an overseer. And remember they killed the babies? I mean, and so God is saying, and the people that were doing it, and then Moses intercedes. And that's one of his constant deals, isn't it? He's interceding. God, forgive them, please. And God did. He stopped the fire. Now it says, the mixed multitude, that's a key verse, were lusting for better food. Now, the mixed multitude are those that were not 100% on board with the program. For those that you know, when you were working, there were people on the workforce, they weren't with the program. And that's discouraging to everybody else. Well, this is what Jay Vernon says who the mixed multitude were. They were Egyptian enough not to want to be there. They were perhaps children of mixed marriages or those that married Egyptians. Now, this brings up the whole thing about dating witnessing. You know, young Christians will say, well, I'm gonna date this non-Christian, but I'm gonna convert him. I don't think that works often. Or we'll get married and afterwards he or she, they'll become a Christian. Well, hopefully they do, and sometimes they do, you know. But it doesn't always work.
Let me tell you a silly story. In our church, in our youth group, there weren't any decent guys. I mean, there was this retarded family that looked at me and actually drooled. And I said, and I would have nightmares that my father would make me marry these guys. Well, then I met Tom, and he obviously wasn't a Christian. And we went together for 4 years. And he was getting there. And he did get there eventually.
Right.
And the same thing with my two sisters. We all had to. And my mother converted my other boyfriends. In fact, one stayed in contact with her until she died. Now he's still in contact with me and sends me all these things on these Christian concerts and such.
Yeah.
But it works sometimes.
It works sometimes, that's right.
But you can't
But
depend on it.
It's a dangerous proposition for a 13-year-old, 14-year-old to say, because, and then, you know, and then the whole idea too, I'm gonna fix them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why the Bible teaches you not to be unequally yoked.
Unequally yoked, yeah.
Famous last words.
Yeah, I'll fix them. And often, it's the other way around. Or
Tom
can be.
didn't drool, did he?
Famous last words.
Tom didn't
It was
drool,
he was an upgrade.
That's good.
They were C&E Christians.
Okay. Yeah. Remember in Fiddler on the Roof, you know, when the matchmaker, you know, well, you know, what's worse than, you know, is not having any husband at all. They might be, you know, 80, you know, but and you're 20, but that's okay.
The worst might be having a husband.
Yeah. So verses 5 through 6, where they start talking about what about the good old days? They were tired of manna. Now, the Bible describes that manna wasn't all that bland. It makes it sound like you could fry it, you could boil it, you could knead it, and can make, you know. And they probably had a gluten-free version too. Well, they should have. They'd have to. Right.
Lots of vitamins in it.
Right, right. And they had to have, it had to be nutritionally rich.
Mrs. Moses cookbook.
Yeah, this is Moses' cookbook, yeah. But they didn't really appreciate how wonderful it was.
Didn't have any garlic.
They didn't have any, yeah, what about those melons? What about the fish? And remember, they went through the desert for 40 years. They did not have nutritional diseases. You don't have record of them having scurvy, beriberi, rickets, all of those things. It had to be, I mean, God sent it, and God made man. He knew what was in it. It would be interesting to have been able to taste it. And to have that, to know what it was like. So, and remember that Jesus is the manna from heaven. It was symbolic. He's the bread of life. Jesus is the bread of life. Another looking forward. And we get fed too, the manna from heaven, by reading scripture. You know, Radio Bible Class, of course, has their classic Our Daily Bread. And remember, when they did collect manna, they were only to take it for that day, unless it was the day before the Sabbath. And that was going to last them. And if they tried to keep it, well, it would go bad. And they could gather enough, whatever they needed, they had enough. So their teenage boys, they could eat as much as they wanted. I told you that when I was at Bethel and I think at Sunday school, I got some kids invited me to come into the lunchroom, and man, oh man, was that nice. I mean, it's a food court, you know, and they can eat as much as they want, which is, you know, a teenager's dream, you know, especially the boys, you know. So let's read now verses 10 through 15. The complaint to Moses. Now Moses finally is up to here. He's fed up. Can you blame him? So, Ken, do you have that one, 10 through 15?
11?
Yeah.
Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child, to that land that you swore to give to their fathers. Where am I to get meat to give to all these people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. And if you will treat me like this, kill me at once, if I find favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness."
Well, there was a prayer that God didn't answer. Kill me at once. Sounds like kind of like Elijah. And
Woe is me.
woe is me. But understandably, I mean, think what Moses said. I mean, all the people are lined up outside his tent. Give us meat. Give us meat. But he's right. I cannot bear this alone. And God never expected him to do it alone. And, you know, and many people in Christian ministries get burned out. They get ulcers, and they have stress-related symptoms. They have broken marriages themselves because of the stress. And so Moses had a legitimate beef, but God wasn't going to hear it. He said, okay, verse 16. He had a beef. Where's the beef? Okay. He says, okay, you get 70 good guys, and we're going to make 70 elders. That's kind of an evangelical's nightmare, though, to have 70 elders. So they were going to appoint 70 elders, which was, God was going to disperse his authority onto these 70. Well, the bad news of that is, God gave in to Moses and said, okay, I'll do this. Just like he gave in to Aaron, remember. He said, I can't do it, I can't speak. Okay, Aaron's coming, he's a good speaker. He took Dale Carnegie first. But the bad news, this continued for centuries, having these 70. And who did they become? Anybody know? Who were the 70 in the New Testament? The Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. The people that met together and voted, let's crucify Christ.
But Jesus sent out 70, didn't he?
Would there be
Wasn't it
difference?
72 or something that he sent out to help do miracles and everything?
Well, not 70, I think. I don't think it's that number, but he,
Well, there
I mean,
was-
he sent out a group, right?
Yeah.
But these were the institutional heads of the Jewish faith that were, the Sanhedrin were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and very few of them were really on board with Jesus, except for Nicodemus. So anyways, that, was that a mistake then? Well, I don't know. I mean, it certainly morphed into something that wasn't good. Aaron certainly morphed into something that wasn't good. So we can talk about just application. Do we need more and more layers of organization in groups and, like in businesses or in school districts?
The council of the world, they then send a committee.
Right. Or like Ronald Reagan's famous quote, he says, "The words you don't want to hear, I'm the government, I'm here to help."
Yeah.
But God said he will give some of the anointing to the 70 to share responsibility. And Jay Vernon, in his commentary on this, he says, if you are weary in doing too much, maybe you are doing too much. You don't have to say yes to every need there is. You have to know your skill set and what you're good at, and because a lot of people can't say no, and they end up burning up. Remember, Jesus said in the New Testament, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. What he gives you to do, he'll also give you the power to do. So I think that's pretty much the end. We're going to continue in chapter 11. And in chapter 12, coming up, if you want to read ahead in there, even Aaron and Miriam turn on him. Poor Moses. I hope he got a lot of crowns in heaven. So we'll see a little clip next week too of Miriam and Aaron. And Miriam's kind of the worst there, as the big sister. She kind of knows, my little brother Moses, he's telling me what to do. So, well, thank you for coming, and we'll continue it next week. And we'll let God arise and let his enemies be scattered.
In BSF, we're studying the book of Jeremiah.
Okay.
And I feel sorry for Jeremiah.
Yeah.
Same situation.
Yeah.
Very much.
Right. Just about all the prophets.